The issue of violence in the Old Testament narratives is a theme we've touched a few times during the course, and it presents a unique kind of challenge. So sometimes the challenges that we may face with things we see in the Bible, they may come out of a lack of knowledge. We just don't know enough, and so that's why certain passages may be challenging. Sometimes Christians find themselves challenged by text in the Bible because of a lack of faith or a lack of trust in God. But this is not the case here. In fact, it seems the other way around. It seems the more we know about God and we know that we reflect on what Jesus reveals about God, his love, and how Jesus commands us to love even our enemies, the Old Testament passages of violence start to seem very incongruous and harder to understand. And because of that, it's in a sense, it's an ongoing challenge. We probably never this side of glory will have a perfect resolution. What I'm trying to do in this short video is perhaps show some ways of thinking about the theme and understanding the passages that allow us to perhaps hold on to the Old Testament also as God's words for us, even if we still do not find every single text clear to understand. Some Christians are pacifist and they are opposed to any kind of violence and any association of God with violence. And for them, this is an even bigger challenge. And they do offer some quite sophisticated and complex readings of the Old Testament to try and handle it. I'm not from that persuasion, and I accept that given that God committed himself to Israel and committed himself to Israel's story in the land, this involved God becoming linked with the whole issue of Israel's relationships with her neighbors and the politics of the time in which warfare and violence were a key factor. Then it's interesting to say that even when God becomes involved, that does not mean there's a free mandate for people to do whatever they wish. And there are interesting occasions in the Bible when, even though someone has been following God's mandate, they are still brought to account for their excesses in the violence they've used, as the following example shows.
Jehu got up and went into the house. Then the prophet poured the oil on Jehu's head and declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anoint you king over the Lord's people Israel. You are to destroy the house of Ahab your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants the prophets and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. The whole house of Ahab will perish."
Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel."
Here we see that Jehu was told by God to enact judgment on the house of Ahab for all the sins he had committed. However, if you read in the text, you'll see that Jehu goes way beyond this. mandate and goes on a killing spree, and in fact kills the king of Judah who happened to be around, and he actually sets a train of emotion which almost leads to the end of the line of David. And because of this going beyond his mandate, the prophet Hosea is then announcing that the house of Jehu will face justice, will face accountability for this. It's important to emphasize again, as we're discussing violence, that we are not talking about a racial issue or racial violence. Modern racial categories or even ethnic categories are not really applicable to Old Testament times. The Israelites would have been very similar to their surrounding neighbors, and probably, if we're being anachronistic, if we were to do DNA testing in those days, we probably wouldn't have found much to separate them from the rest. The Israelites were of mixed heritage. We know that those are the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, would have had Egyptian heritage through Joseph's wife. Those from the tribe of Judah would have had Canaanite heritage through Judah's wife and also his daughter-in-law Tamar. And we also read how many people from other backgrounds left Egypt alongside the Israelites and would have intermingled with them. So we're not talking about racial categories in the modern sense. We're talking about principally a religious separation, as a people devoted exclusively to their one God, whom they believed was the only God. This is what separates the Israelites from the other nations, and therefore we find that the boundaries can sometimes get quite porous. So we see that in the story of Jericho, Rahab, who is a Canaanite, becomes incorporated into the people of Israel, and in fact becomes one of David's ancestors, whereas Achan, who disobeyed God, gets treated like a Canaanite. And later on in the story, we find Ruth, a Moabite, incorporated into Israel and also an ancestor of David. One thing that we are becoming increasingly aware of is that the Bible was written in a different time from us. God chose to reveal himself in cultures which were different to our own. And so rather than having the arrogance of trying to make God's word fit into our own culture, we need to have the humility to explore what it would have meant on its own terms. And I think it's important to remember that we come from culture often which is very much into quantifying, and more with all these smart meters, smart watches, we are getting much more obsessed with quantifying every dimension in life and more accurate and more detailed in how we count. The biblical culture was not like that at all, much less mathematical, much less precise. In fact, they didn't even have a symbol for zero, and we're not even sure what kind of concept of zero they would have had. And likewise, in the days of the Bible, in those times, military narratives were often presented initially in very exaggerated, hyperbolic terms, that claims would be made about complete annihilation, utter destruction. And then as you read the narrative further, you realize it's a bit more nuanced, and perhaps those who are completely annihilated actually survived and different arrangements were made. And you'll find this if you read Assyrian war narratives, Persian war narratives, Babylonian narratives. And in that sense, the Israelite narratives are the same. We will often have a very initial surface level, very dramatic rhetorical declaration of absolute victory, absolute destruction. And the narrative itself will then provide us the more nuanced details. And so sometimes we will come across this claims that a whole people were annihilated, or even a town is completely destroyed, and then you will go along a narrative, and further along you will see the same people group present, or even the same town or city, which is a narrative way of showing us that it's a bit more nuanced than a surface level might indicate. And perhaps no text makes this more starkly clearer than the following example.
Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab the commander of the army, who had gone up to bury the dead, had struck down all the men in Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months, until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking people from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food.
Verse 15 tells us quite clearly that Joab killed all the men of Edom. And then just to make sure there's no doubt and to make it clear, we then have it repeated again in verse 16 that Joab destroyed all the men in Edom. But then we have this puzzling statement in verse 17, for us at least. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served with his father. And you might be wondering, if you're taking it very literally, well, if Joab destroyed all the men, how did Hadad survive? And who on earth are these Edomite officials who flee to Egypt with him? And the interesting thing is the text doesn't even bother explaining that to us. And in fact, it gets interesting later on, because when Hadad grows up and he knows that David has died, Joab has died, he turns around to Pharaoh and says, let me go back to my country. And that suggests there's a country for him to return to. And again, you might, if you're taking it very woodenly, well, if Joab's killed all the men, how on earth is there a country? And it's just interesting that the text doesn't even bother to explain this. It just takes it in its stride. And I think it's important that sometimes when you come across a passage where maybe there's a suggestion of complete and utter destruction and annihilation, is to actually look closer in the text further along. And interesting to see what actually do these people emerge again. Because sometimes even this same town or city appear again. And I think that's quite important, so that we are actually taking the text on its own terms and not trying to impose our own perhaps concepts of mathematical quantification and precision on a text from a very different culture. I've already mentioned that there's been no mass extermination of the Canaanites in the course, and that is something that both archaeology and the biblical narrative agree on. And in fact, in the Bible, we see the Canaanite presence throughout the whole of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament times. Matthew identifies the woman who comes desperate to Jesus about the demon that is possessing her daughter as a Canaanite woman. Nonetheless, for many people, it still remains a question, well, did God order it? No, in fact, that Israel didn't do it is one thing, but it would still be disturbing that God had ordered it. This is quite a complex issue, and it involves how we interpret different passages. And the key passage in this sense is Deuteronomy chapter 7.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, For they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them: break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession.
This text comes with a command that the people of Israel must destroy completely the other nations, and this would seem to be inequivocal. It suggests a complete annihilation of the Canaanites. Nonetheless, as we look at it closer, we start to see that things are perhaps not as clear cut. To begin with, the text actually talks about God driving out the nations, and this kind of suggests expulsion and exile rather than complete destruction, similar to what would happen later on to Israel and Judah when they disobeyed the Lord and were driven out of the land. Also, the actual Hebrew term herem, which many of our Bibles translate as completely and utterly destroy, actually has the idea of completely consecrating and devoting something to God and not making any personal use of it. Now, this term can have the meaning, and often does have the meaning, of complete destruction, which is why many translations opt for that. However, as we read along, we start to see other commands which don't seem to sit comfortably with the idea that the Hebrews would completely annihilate the other people. They're told not to make treaties with them, which seems a superfluous command if they're going to be completely destroyed. And later on, they're also commanded not to intermarry, not to marry with people from the other nations. And again, that would seem strange, as one scholar once commented, dead people, corpses don't get married. So there seems to be something else going on in this command, rather than a complete 100% utter extermination of different nations. It's quite a complex issue, and it's not going to get a perfect answer, but a working solution that I have developed, which enables me to read this passage as God's scripture and teach and preach from it. And this is actually influenced by a Baptist scholar called Helen Painter, is to see this command to completely destroy or completely set aside the nations as referring to their political death, their political extermination, and especially in a context where the kings and the rulers were seen to stand for all the people. And it helps remember that in the time of the conquest and the time of the Old Testament, these nations would essentially have been city-states in which most of the population would have been rural and agricultural, and the kings and the nobility would have governed from cities, which by our standards would have been small towns. In times of war, the rural population would seek shelter within the city, and thus the destruction of the nations would be destruction of their political existence. The cities would be burned down and destroyed, the royal family and the nobility put to death, so there would be no continuity. And yet the rural population would have gone back to the countryside and pretty much carried on with life, although under a different political arrangement. Now, of course, still for some of, we may still feel that within this command, the level of violence probably still makes us uncomfortable, especially as it would have extended to the whole of the family, the king and the nobles. And it is still quite a violent times that we are dealing with, but I don't think it is necessary to envisage that God had ordered the 100% absolute complete extermination of every single person as we would measure it. How should we read these texts today, especially realizing that some groups in the past and even the present have appropriated these texts in disturbing ways? If you look back in colonial history, there were even some Puritans who would justify mistreating the native indigenous American peoples by framing them as the Canaanites standing in the way of the Puritans who were occupying their new promised land. I think it's important to recognize that we don't approach these texts raw and filtered. In fact, very few Jews do. Most Jews approach these texts through the tradition of rabbinical interpretation, and we approach the Old Testament and especially these passages in the light of Jesus and in the light of what Jesus has revealed about God. And it's important to remember that in the light of Jesus, God's people are no longer a political entity existing in a geographical space under a human king. Rather, God's people is now a supranational people, people of different tribes, tongues, and languages who actually live under different human governments but are submitted to the one true King of all kings, Jesus. And in that sense, it's also important to remember that because of this, our enemies and our opponents are no longer human beings. We're told that our warfare, unlike Old Testament warfare, is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and power, against spiritual forces of darkness in the heavenly realms. That is our conflict takes place on in that dimension. And so Christians are no longer not to use violence in the proclamation of the gospel, rather depend on the power of the Holy Spirit. And important, therefore, to also remember that famous question that Joshua asked the captain of the Lord's army: are you on our side or on the side of our enemies? And the captain replies, neither. I come in the name of the Lord of hosts. The issue is not to recruit God on our side for whatever political battle or social cause we are willing to fight for, but really to see that we are engaged and on God's side in what he is wanting to do.